He is just a nobody, my wife said, and the table laughed before she even finished smiling. I remember the exact second because Grant Holloway was holding a glass of bourbon halfway to his mouth. Lauren was standing beside him in an emerald dress, and I was 3 feet away pretending the words had not landed exactly where she intended. Vantage Meridian Technologies had rented the top-floor ballroom of a luxury hotel in Charlotte for its annual leadership dinner, the kind of place where the chandeliers looked expensive enough to require insurance, and every conversation seemed to begin with a job title. Lauren belonged there. At least that was how she carried herself. She was vice president of strategic partnerships, surrounded by executives who spoke in acquisition targets, quarterly projections, and private clubs. I was her husband, Ethan Caldwell, wearing a charcoal suit I had owned for 6 years and a watch nobody at that table would recognize. Grant looked at me with an easy smile. "So what do you do, Ethan?" Before I could answer, Lauren gave a small laugh. "He does some consulting from home. Investments here and there. Nothing like what we do." Then she added it. "Honestly, he is just a nobody compared to this crowd." The laughter was polite at first. Then Chad from corporate development leaned back and said, "That must be relaxing. No board meetings, no shareholders, no $200 million deals keeping you awake." More laughter. Lauren joined in. That was the part one felt. Not Grant. Not Chad. Her. I did not raise my voice. I did not correct her. I simply looked at the woman I had been married to for 14 years and wondered when my silence had become permission for her to make me smaller. Grant seemed pleased with the joke and shifted the conversation back to himself. He started talking about Vantage Meridian's biggest acquisition yet, a Texas automation company called Redwood Automation. $200 million. Complicated financing. Tight closing schedule. A deal that, according to Grant, would transform the company. I listened while he explained it to the table like a quarterback describing the winning play. Seller rollover. Structured debt. Institutional capital. He spoke with the confidence of a man certain nobody nearby understood the machinery behind the words. I knew every number he mentioned. I knew the leverage ratio. I knew the revised cash requirement. I knew which covenant their lawyers had argued about that morning. At 5:30 that same day, I had been sitting at my kitchen table with black coffee, reading the final financing memo for Redwood Automation before most of the people in that ballroom were awake. Grant kept talking. Lauren kept smiling. I said nothing. That was when he lifted his glass toward me and said, "Do not worry, Ethan. Deals like this are probably pretty boring if you are not in the business." I looked at him and almost smiled. He had no idea I was not outside the deal. The deal was waiting for me. People usually imagine power looks expensive. Mine never did. Most mornings, I was awake before 5, moving through a dark kitchen in socks while the coffee maker clicked and the neighborhood outside Charlotte was still asleep. I drove an 8-year-old Ford pickup with a dent near the rear bumper because the truck ran perfectly and I never saw a reason to replace something that still did its job. My office sat 20 minutes from home in a renovated brick building behind a medical complex. No marble lobby, no giant sign, no receptionist announcing my name. Blackridge Capital Partners occupied most of the second floor, but visitors rarely knew that unless they had an appointment. I liked it that way. By 6:30, I was usually reading financial models, reviewing manufacturing companies, or speaking with attorneys in New York, Dallas, and Chicago. By 8, I could be discussing $50 million in structured debt while wearing the same boots I used to clean leaves from my gutters on Saturday. That disconnect confused people. Eventually, it confused Lauren too. When we first married, she understood exactly what I was building. Back then, Blackridge was small enough that she knew several employees by name. She would bring dinner to the office when negotiations ran late and sit across from me while I explained why one company was worth buying and another was not. She used to say she loved that I could talk about millions of dollars and still get excited about saving 20 cents a gallon on gasoline. Somewhere along the way, that became less charming to her. Her career accelerated. New title, better office, bigger clients, more dinners where everybody introduced themselves by position before personality. I was happy for her. Truly, I had watched Lauren work for every promotion she earned. But success changed the questions she asked. She stopped asking what I was building and started asking why I still drove the old truck. She stopped asking about my investments and started mentioning the vacation homes owned by other executives. When colleagues asked about me, she shortened my work into something easier to explain. consulting, investments, working from home sometimes. None of those things were technically false. They were simply pieces small enough to make the whole picture disappear. At first, I corrected the details privately. Then I stopped. Not because I was hiding anything. Because every explanation seemed to reach her after she had already decided it was not important. There is a strange point in a marriage when being misunderstood stops feeling accidental. You notice the way your spouse describes you differently, depending on who is listening. You notice the smile that appears when someone assumes less of you. You notice how quickly silence becomes somebody else's version of the truth. Sitting in that ballroom, I realized Lauren had not embarrassed me with one sentence. That sentence had been years in the making. Grant saw a husband with an old pickup and an undefined job. Lauren had helped him see exactly that. Across the table, he was still talking about redwood automation, explaining how difficult the financing had been to secure. I turned my glass slowly between my fingers and listened. He thought he was describing the biggest deal of his career to a man who barely understood business. What he could not know was that before sunrise that morning, I had marked 3 changes in the same financing package he was celebrating. And one of them was serious enough that nobody at Vantage Meridian was getting my signature until I understood why it had changed. There was a time when Lauren would have been the first person in the room to correct anyone who underestimated me. I remembered it while Grant kept talking, because 14 years earlier she had known Blackridge before it had conference rooms, legal teams, or enough money to make people return phone calls quickly. Back then, Lauren and I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment outside Charlotte with thin walls, secondhand furniture, and a kitchen table that doubled as my office after dinner. She was 28, working long hours in an entry-level strategy role, while I was trying to turn a small advisory business into something that could survive its first bad year. We counted expenses carefully. Friday nights meant takeout and spreadsheets. Vacations meant driving 3 hours to the mountains because plane tickets felt irresponsible. None of it embarrassed her. She used to sit beside me with her shoes kicked off, reading company reports she barely understood just because she wanted to know what had kept me awake until midnight. When I landed my first serious client, she bought a $12 bottle of sparkling wine and told me one day people would wish they had taken my calls earlier. I never forgot that. I also never forgot what happened when her own career began rising. Lauren earned it. She was smart, organized, and better in a conference room than most people twice her age. First came a promotion, then another. Her salary climbed. Her wardrobe changed. The dinners became more expensive, the invitations more exclusive, and suddenly we were spending weekends around people who compared neighborhoods the way ordinary families compared grocery stores. At first, Lauren laughed about it with me. She would come home from some executive dinner, take off her heels, and tell me how ridiculous it was that grown adults could spend 20 minutes discussing golf clubs and vacation homes. Then the jokes changed. She started mentioning those vacation homes without laughing. She noticed whose husband drove what. She noticed which couples belonged to private clubs. She noticed that one executive had renovated a lake house for more than we had paid for our first home. Comparison entered quietly. That was the dangerous part. It never announced itself as dissatisfaction. It sounded practical. Maybe we should upgrade the truck. Maybe our kitchen looked dated. Maybe I should dress differently at company events. Maybe I should be more visible. I try not to take it personally. People evolve. Careers change you. Social circles change you. Marriage is supposed to bend without breaking. So I bent. I bought better suits. I attended dinners I would rather have skipped. I smiled when Lauren introduced me as someone who worked in investments. But eventually she stopped asking what those investments actually were. One evening, about 4 years before that gala, I came home excited because Blackridge had closed the largest industrial transaction in its history. Lauren was answering emails at the kitchen island. I told her we had finally finished it. She smiled without looking up and said, "That is great, honey. Your little investment thing is really keeping you busy." Little investment thing. I remember standing there with my briefcase still in my hand, hearing those words settle into the room. I could have corrected her. I could have told her exactly what we had closed, exactly how large Blackridge had become, exactly how many people now depended on decisions made in my office. I did not. I told myself humility mattered more than recognition. Looking back, that was the night I stopped explaining. And Lauren never noticed the silence. By the time Blackridge Capital Partners became something other firms took seriously, I had already learned that money changed rooms before you even entered them. It started slowly. A banker who once ignored my calls suddenly remembered my birthday. A former client who had questioned every invoice began inviting me to golf. People who had never asked about my life became interested in where I vacationed, what I drove, and whether I knew anyone who could finance their next idea. That was when I decided Blackridge would grow without turning me into a public personality. We focused on industrial companies, logistics businesses, manufacturing firms, and eventually automation. I preferred businesses that made something real, moved something real, or solved a problem somebody could actually explain. Over 18 years, the firm went from a rented office with 4 employees to managing investments large enough that our decisions could determine whether acquisitions closed. I never put my face on magazine covers. I rarely attended industry conferences unless there was a reason. My senior partners handled most public negotiations. By design, plenty of executives knew Blackridge without knowing me. That arrangement suited me perfectly. Redwood Automation entered our pipeline 8 months before Lauren's company dinner. Vantage Meridian wanted to acquire the Texas-based automation manufacturer because its robotic systems could expand Vantage Meridian into several new industrial markets. The proposed enterprise value was roughly $200 million. Ambitious, but not unreasonable. The problem was financing. Vantage Meridian could not responsibly fund the entire acquisition from its own balance sheet. So Blackridge agreed to lead a consortium providing structured capital alongside senior lenders. My team handled most of the meetings. Michael Brennan, Vantage Meridian's chief financial officer, dealt primarily with our managing director. Rachel Pierce, their general counsel, spent weeks exchanging documents with our legal team. Grant Holloway appeared on major calls, but even then, I usually listened without announcing myself. I cared about the numbers, not introductions. There was one detail Grant did not know. Blackridge's investment committee could recommend the transaction, our lawyers could negotiate every paragraph, and our financing partners could prepare the funds, but the final commitment still required my approval. My signature. That was not ego. It was governance. $200 million created enough risk that nobody at my firm, including me, got to treat the closing like a formality. That morning, before Lauren and I dressed for the gala, I had reviewed the latest closing package at our kitchen table. 3 changes had caught my attention. 2 were ordinary. The third was not. Someone on Vantage Meridian's side had altered language connected to a change of control covenant and shifted more downside exposure toward the financing group. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Deals changed constantly near closing, but reasonable explanations were supposed to arrive with disclosure. This one had not. I marked the page, sent a note to our legal team, and went upstairs to get dressed. Lauren passed me in the hallway while fastening an earring and asked whether I had been working on anything interesting. I almost told her. Then her phone rang. She answered before I finished the first sentence. By the time we reached the ballroom that evening, she had forgotten she asked. Now I sat beside her listening to Grant celebrate the very transaction sitting unfinished on my desk. He called it practically done. He told the table funding was secured and closing was only days away. Lauren smiled proudly when he said it. I watched him raise his glass and realized something almost ironic. Everyone at that table thought the biggest uncertainty in the room was whether Vantage Meridian could successfully integrate Redwood Automation. It was not. The biggest uncertainty was whether I was going to sign the deal at all. Lauren never needed a secret password to know what I did. That was the part people would probably misunderstand if they heard the story later. I had never hidden Blackridge from my wife. She knew the firm's name. She knew I had partners, employees, lawyers, and investments spread across several states. She had attended our first holiday dinner when we could still fit the entire company around 2 restaurant tables. What she did not know was what Blackridge had become, because somewhere along the way she stopped looking closely enough to notice. Growth had happened quietly. 1 industrial investment became 3. 3 became a portfolio. We started financing acquisitions instead of simply advising on them. Our Dallas office opened. Then Chicago. By the time our capital commitments regularly crossed 9 figures, Lauren was deep inside her own career at Vantage Meridian. I would mention a meeting in New York, and she would assume it was consulting. I would fly to Texas for a closing, and she would ask whether the hotel was decent before changing the subject to her quarterly targets. Once, I brought home a bottle of bourbon after Blackridge completed a transaction that had taken 14 months to negotiate. I poured 2 glasses and told her it was the largest deal we had ever closed. She smiled, touched her glass to mine, then spent the next 20 minutes telling me about Grant reorganizing her division. I listened. I always listened. That was the difference I started noticing. I knew the names of her coworkers. I knew which promotion she wanted. I knew why Michael Brennan frustrated her during budget season and why Grant's approval mattered for her next step. She could not have named two of my partners. At first, I blamed timing. Two ambitious careers under one roof create blind spots. Then I blamed myself. Maybe I was too private. Maybe I made success look so ordinary that she stopped recognizing it as success. But there is only so long a man can keep offering pieces of his life to someone who keeps setting them down unopened. Eventually, I stopped bringing work home. Not to punish her. Not to create some dramatic reveal years later. I simply got tired of explaining something she no longer seemed curious about. The strange thing was that Lauren filled the empty space with assumptions. She decided Blackridge had stayed small because I stayed quiet. She decided my flexible schedule meant I worked less. She decided the absence of public recognition meant there was nothing significant to recognize. None of those conclusions came from a lie I told her. They came from questions she stopped asking. Sitting beside her at the gala, I watched her laugh with people who knew less about me than she did, and somehow she had chosen their version anyway. That hurt more than being underestimated by strangers. Grant could be forgiven for not knowing me. Lauren had shared 14 years of mornings, flights, late calls, signatures, celebrations, and silence with me. She had been standing close enough to see everything. She simply stopped paying attention. Across the table, Grant continued describing the Redwood financing with the confidence of a man who believed the important people involved were somewhere else. Then Rachel Pierce, Vantage Meridian's general counsel, joined us carrying a folder under one arm. Grant introduced me casually. Rachel shook my hand, looked at my face for an extra second, and did not let go immediately. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Recognition had not arrived yet, but something had. She narrowed her eyes and asked me where we had met before. Rachel kept studying me while the noise of the ballroom moved around us. I gave her the easiest answer available. I told her we had probably been on the same conference call at some point. That was technically possible. Over the previous 8 months, I had joined several Redwood discussions without speaking much, usually with my camera off, while my managing director handled the presentation. Rachel nodded, but the question did not leave her face. Grant seemed amused by the whole thing. He told her she was probably confusing me with somebody from one of their outside consulting firms. Lauren smiled and said that happened all the time because I had one of those faces people thought they recognized. Another small joke. Another easy reduction. I let it pass. Grant turned back toward the acquisition and said the difficult work was basically finished now. He explained that Redwood had strong technology but weak distribution, while Vantage Meridian had the customer relationships to scale it nationally. I agreed that the industrial logic made sense. He looked surprised that I had an opinion. Then he smiled the way people do when they decide to be generous. He asked whether I followed mergers and acquisitions as part of my consulting work. I told him occasionally. Lauren shifted beside me. I knew that movement. It was the same one she made when she worried I was stepping into a conversation she considered hers. Grant asked what I thought of the transaction. I could have given him a harmless answer. Instead, I asked how comfortable he was with the leverage ratio after the latest revision to the purchase price. Michael Brennan, the chief financial officer, stopped reaching for his drink. Grant blinked once and said their financing team had modeled it carefully. I nodded and asked how much seller equity was rolling into the new structure. Michael answered that one. Then I asked whether the change of control covenant in the final draft still allowed the financing group to accelerate certain protections if operating performance missed the first-year threshold. The table went quiet in a different way. Not shocked. Alert. Rachel's eyes locked on mine. She asked where I had seen that language. I told her I had not said I had seen it. I had asked whether it was there. Grant laughed, but the sound came out thinner than before. He said I certainly knew more about deals than Lauren had suggested. Lauren looked at me, and instead of curiosity, I saw irritation. That hurt in a way Grant could not have managed if he tried. She leaned closer and quietly asked why I was doing this. I asked what she meant. She said I was turning a casual conversation into an interrogation. I told her I was only asking questions. Grant waved it off and said he enjoyed talking business with anybody willing to learn. Anybody willing to learn. I almost admired how completely he misunderstood the room. Michael was no longer smiling. Rachel was thinking. She asked whether I knew Blackridge Capital. I took a slow sip of water before answering. I said I knew the firm. Grant immediately said they were tough negotiators, but excellent capital partners, the kind of people you wanted on a serious transaction. Lauren glanced at me as though the name meant almost nothing to her. 14 years of marriage, and my wife was standing 3 feet away while her boss praised the company I had built. Rachel did not look at Grant. She kept looking at me. Then she said the questions I had just asked sounded almost identical to comments Blackridge had sent in its diligence memorandum that morning. The room became very still. I smiled politely and told her good questions tended to sound alike. She did not smile back. Instead, Rachel reached slowly for her phone. Before Rachel could unlock her phone, Lauren touched my arm and asked if she could speak with me for a minute. Her smile stayed in place for the table, but I knew the pressure behind it. We stepped away from the group toward a quieter section near the ballroom windows, where the Charlotte skyline stretched beneath us in scattered lights. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she lowered her voice and asked why I was trying so hard to impress Grant. I thought I had misheard her. I asked what she meant. She glanced toward the table before answering, as if the people behind us mattered more than the conversation in front of her. She said Grant was her chief executive officer, Rachel was general counsel, Michael controlled finance, and this was not the place for me to start challenging them about a transaction I was not involved in. I let that last part sit between us. A transaction I was not involved in. 14 years together, and she could say it with complete confidence. I told her I had not challenged anyone. I had asked 3 questions. Lauren sighed and said that was exactly the problem. According to her, the questions made it look like I was trying to prove I belonged in the conversation. That sentence landed harder than the laughter earlier. Strangers could underestimate me because they had no information. Lauren had years of it. She had watched me leave before sunrise for negotiations. She had seen attorneys called during vacations. She had watched Blackridge grow from 4 employees into something large enough that I sometimes crossed 3 time zones in a week. Somehow, none of that mattered because the people in the ballroom had better titles attached to their name tags. I asked her when asking intelligent questions became embarrassing. She shook her head and said I was twisting her words. Then she told me to stop trying to act smarter than her boss. There it was. Clean. Simple. No misunderstanding left to hide behind. The music from the ballroom suddenly seemed farther away. I looked at the woman who once sat beside me at a cheap kitchen table reading financial reports because she wanted to understand my world, and I barely recognized the distance between that woman and the one standing in front of me. I did not raise my voice. I did not tell her who controlled the signature Grant needed. I asked one question. I asked when protecting her image started requiring her to make me smaller. Lauren opened her mouth, then stopped. Her eyes moved away from mine. For the first time that night, she had nothing ready. No polished answer. No corporate smile. Just silence. I told her the problem was not that Grant thought I was unimportant. Grant barely knew me. The problem was that she had known me for 14 years and had started agreeing with him. Her face changed then. Not enough for an apology. Enough for the words to reach somewhere she had been avoiding. Behind us, I heard Rachel call my name. I turned. She was still holding her phone, but her expression was different now. More certain. She took 2 steps toward us and asked whether Caldwell was my full last name. Lauren answered before I could. She said yes and asked why. Rachel stared at me for another second, then looked down at her screen. I already knew what she was probably finding. Blackridge kept my public profile intentionally limited, but limited did not mean invisible if you knew exactly where to search. I slipped one hand into my pocket and felt my phone vibrate. An email had arrived from Blackridge Legal. Final closing documents received. Signature requested before 9 the next morning. I looked at Lauren, then at Rachel, and made a decision. Whatever happened next was not going to happen in that ballroom. I told Lauren I was leaving. She asked if I was seriously walking out over a conversation. I said no. I was leaving because I finally understood the conversation had started years ago. Then I headed toward the elevators while my phone vibrated again. This time, the message came from my general counsel. There was a problem in the final draft. The elevator doors closed behind me, and for the first time that evening, the ballroom disappeared completely. No laughter, no polished introductions, just the low mechanical hum of the elevator and the message glowing on my phone. My general counsel, Daniel Mercer, had highlighted the same covenant I had flagged that morning. Vantage Meridian's final draft shifted additional downside risk toward our financing group if Redwood missed certain operating targets during the first year after closing. That alone was not unusual. What bothered Daniel was the timing. The language had been changed after our legal team approved the previous version, and nobody had attached a formal explanation. I read his message twice before calling him. He answered immediately. Daniel told me the closing package had arrived 40 minutes earlier with a request for my signature before 9 the next morning. Our attorneys had compared the documents automatically and found several changes. Most were administrative. One was material. I stepped through the hotel lobby and into the cold Charlotte night while he explained the details. Cars moved along the street. Valets hurried between the entrance and the parking lane. Everything outside looked completely ordinary while a $200 million transaction sat unfinished on my phone. Daniel asked whether I wanted him to reject the package. I said no. Rejecting a deal before understanding the reason would have been emotional, and I had no intention of letting what happened upstairs influence a business decision. I told him to hold the signature and notify the financing team that final approval was pending clarification. Nothing more. No threats. No reference to Grant. No mention of Lauren. Just procedure. Daniel paused, then asked whether something had happened at the dinner. He knew I rarely attended corporate events. I told him we could discuss that another time. Tonight, I needed facts. He said he would have the comparison report waiting for me within the hour. I ended the call as the valet brought my pickup around. The truck looked almost comical beneath the hotel lights, surrounded by luxury sedans and black sport utility vehicles. Earlier, that contrast had helped people decide who I was. Now it made me smile for a different reason. I climbed inside and placed my phone on the passenger seat. Before I could start the engine, Lauren called. I watched her name appear, disappear, then appear again. I did not answer immediately. I was not trying to punish her. I simply knew that if we spoke while the ballroom was still fresh in both our minds, we would argue about words instead of what those words revealed. Her third call became a message. She said I was embarrassing her by leaving. I stared at that sentence longer than I expected. Not hurting her, not worrying her, embarrassing her. Even now, her first concern was how the room would interpret my absence. I started the truck. A second message arrived from Daniel before I pulled away. The updated covenant had been inserted at the request of Vantage Meridian's executive team, but the financing group had not been given the supporting risk analysis. He recommended withholding approval until morning. I typed back 6 words. Do not release my signature tonight. Then I drove home through streets shining under winter lights. Behind me, Grant was still celebrating a transaction he believed was finished. Lauren was still inside a ballroom worried about appearances. And somewhere on Vantage Meridian's closing checklist, one empty signature line had just become the most important space in the entire deal. By 7:15 the next morning, Grant Holloway was still treating the closing like a scheduling problem. I knew that because Daniel called me from Blackridge while I was pouring coffee at home and said Vantage Meridian had already sent 3 messages asking when funds would be released. Lauren had come home after midnight. We had barely spoken. She slept upstairs. I spent most of the night at the kitchen table reading the revised documents line by line. The change was worse than it first appeared. Vantage Meridian had inserted language that shifted operating risk toward our financing group while preserving management flexibility for itself. In plain English, if Redwood underperformed after closing, Blackridge would absorb more exposure while Vantage Meridian kept broader control over the decisions that could create that underperformance. I did not need anger to reject that structure. The numbers did it for me. At 8:20, Michael Brennan called Daniel directly. By 8:35, Rachel Pierce was on the line too. They wanted to know who had stopped final approval. Daniel gave them the answer required by the closing process. The managing partner, Ethan Caldwell. For several seconds, nobody on their side responded. Daniel told me later that Michael asked him to repeat the name. Rachel did not. She had already started connecting the pieces from the night before. At Vantage Meridian headquarters, Grant apparently walked into the finance conference room expecting to solve the issue in 10 minutes. He asked why an outside investment firm was suddenly delaying a transaction everyone had agreed was ready to close. Michael explained that Blackridge had not released its final commitment because the revised covenant had not been approved. Grant asked who at Blackridge had authority to clear it. Rachel answered, Ethan Caldwell. Grant said there had to be another Ethan Caldwell. Rachel opened the counterparty profile used by their legal department. My professional biography was intentionally short. Founder, managing partner, industrial investment strategy, 18 years at Blackridge. A small photograph sat beside the text. Nothing dramatic. Just me in a dark suit against a gray background. The same face Grant had spent the previous evening explaining acquisitions to. I was not in that room, but Rachel told me later the silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Grant finally asked the question everyone else was already thinking. Was this Lauren Caldwell's husband? Rachel said yes. Michael sat down. Grant asked why nobody had told him. Rachel reminded him that Blackridge had been represented throughout negotiations by its transaction team and that my involvement had always been documented in the final approval structure. He simply had never paid attention to the name. That detail mattered to me. Nobody had deceived Grant. He had seen what he expected to see. A quiet husband, an undefined job, an old suit, a man Lauren herself had reduced to something insignificant. At 8:53, Lauren walked into the conference room for a scheduled strategy meeting and found Grant, Michael, and Rachel staring at the same profile. She told me later that she knew something was wrong before anyone spoke. Grant turned the monitor toward her and asked whether Ethan Caldwell of Blackridge Capital Partners was her husband. Lauren looked at my photograph, then at the company name beneath it. For once, she did not have a quick answer. Rachel asked if she knew I held final approval on the Redwood financing. Lauren whispered that she did not. Grant looked at the clock. 7 minutes remained before the signature deadline they had requested. Then he said the sentence Lauren would remember long after the deal itself was forgotten. He told her they needed her husband on the phone. My phone rang at 9 o'clock exactly. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the closing documents open on my laptop and a fresh cup of coffee cooling beside me. Lauren's name appeared first, but when I answered, Grant Holloway was the one who spoke. His voice had changed overnight. The easy confidence from the ballroom was gone. He greeted me formally, then said he had just learned about my role at Blackridge Capital Partners. I told him I assumed Rachel had explained it. There was a pause. He said she had. Then he moved quickly to the reason for the call. Vantage Meridian needed the Redwood financing released that morning. Lawyers were waiting. Sellers were waiting. Several deadlines depended on the closing. Grant said he hoped whatever happened at dinner would not interfere with a transaction this important. I looked at the covenant highlighted on my screen. That sentence told me he still misunderstood me. I told him the dinner had nothing to do with my decision. If he had treated me like an old friend, the document would still be wrong. If Lauren had introduced me as the most important man in the room, the document would still be wrong. Business did not become safer because somebody apologized. Silence followed. Then Michael Brennan joined the call and explained that the revised language had been intended to give Vantage Meridian more flexibility during integration. I told him flexibility was not the problem. Undisclosed risk transfer was. Rachel spoke next. She admitted the change should have been flagged directly to Blackridge before the final package was circulated. That was the first useful sentence I heard. I told them I was willing to review a corrected draft immediately. Grant asked whether that meant I would sign once the language was restored. I said it meant I would sign if the deal remained sound after review. Nothing more. Then Lauren spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet. She asked if she could speak to me privately. Grant immediately said he would give us the line. I told him that was unnecessary. This was a business call. Whatever Lauren and I needed to discuss belonged somewhere else. Another silence. I could almost feel her embarrassment through the phone, but I refused to turn it into punishment. Grant asked what Blackridge required. I gave him 3 conditions. Restore the original risk allocation. Provide the operating analysis supporting the first-year projections. Confirm that no additional material changes had been inserted after our legal review. Michael said they could have everything within 2 hours. I told him my team would be ready. Grant thanked me, more carefully this time. Before the call ended, he said he owed me an apology for the previous night. I accepted the acknowledgement but told him something he probably did not expect. He had not known who I was. Lauren had. That was the difference. The line went completely quiet. I ended the call before anyone tried to rescue the moment. 20 minutes later, Daniel sent me a message. Vantage Meridian had already begun revising the package. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt tired. The reversal everyone else would eventually talk about was never the part that mattered to me. Grant had learned my title in less than 12 hours. My wife had spent years forgetting my value without one. At 10:17, another message arrived. It was from Lauren. No excuses. No explanation. Just 6 words. I did not know who I became. Lauren's message stayed on my screen while the revised documents started arriving from Vantage Meridian. I did not answer immediately, not because I wanted her to suffer. I simply did not know how to respond to a realization that had taken years to reach her. By 11:30, Daniel and 2 members of our investment team were in my office reviewing the corrected covenant. Vantage Meridian had restored most of the original risk allocation, but the operating analysis raised another concern. Redwood's first-year projections depended on cost reductions that looked unusually aggressive. I asked Daniel to pull the integration schedule. 10 minutes later, the numbers became clearer. Vantage Meridian planned to eliminate several overlapping departments within 90 days of closing. Some consolidation was expected in an acquisition. This was different. The savings assumptions were carrying too much weight in the model, and the financing package had been structured as if those reductions were guaranteed. I told the team to keep reviewing. At 12:15, Grant called again. This time he asked whether we could meet in person at Blackridge that afternoon. His tone was professional now. No jokes. No assumptions. I agreed and told him to bring Michael, Rachel, and the complete operating plan. Then Lauren called. I answered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said she had spent the morning answering questions from people who suddenly treated her differently because they knew who I was. Some congratulated her. Others became unusually polite. One executive who had barely acknowledged me at dinner asked whether she could arrange an introduction to Blackridge. Lauren said the attention made her uncomfortable. I told her that was one reason I had avoided it for years. She said she understood that now. Then she apologized again, but this time she did not mention Grant, the dinner, or embarrassment. She said she had spent so long measuring people by visibility that she had confused quietness with lack of importance. I told her the problem went deeper than importance. Even if Blackridge had failed 10 years ago, even if I really had been doing small consulting jobs from home, I still deserved not to be diminished by my wife for the convenience of a room. She went silent. Then she said I was right. No defense. No explanation. Just that. It should have felt satisfying. It did not. Truth arriving late can still be truth, but it does not erase the years before it. Lauren asked whether the deal was going to close. I told her I did not know yet. She asked whether I was delaying it because of what happened between us. That question hurt more than I expected. I told her if she believed I would put employees, investors, lenders, and a $200 million transaction at risk to settle a personal score, then she still did not understand me. She apologized immediately. I softened my voice. I told her the deal had real issues and I would sign only when those issues were resolved. She asked if she should attend the afternoon meeting. I said no. Her marriage to me should not place her inside negotiations that were outside her role. For the first time, she did not argue. At 2:45, I stood at the window of Blackridge's conference room while Charlotte moved beneath a gray winter sky. On the table behind me sat the financing package, the integration plan, and one unsigned commitment page. At 2:58, the receptionist called. Grant Holloway, Michael Brennan, and Rachel Pierce had arrived. The man who had spent the previous evening explaining business to me was now downstairs asking permission to enter mine. Grant entered the conference room first, followed by Michael and Rachel. None of them looked like the people from the ballroom the night before. There were no drinks in their hands, no easy smiles, no audience to impress. Just 3 executives carrying folders into a room where the numbers mattered more than status. I invited them to sit. Daniel took the chair beside me, while our investment team remained at the far end of the table. Grant began with an apology. I stopped him before he could turn it into a speech. I told him we were there to discuss Redwood. Whatever happened at dinner belonged somewhere else. He nodded and opened the operating plan. For the next 40 minutes, we worked through the integration assumptions line by line. Michael explained the cost reductions. Rachel clarified the revised covenant. Grant defended the schedule. I listened. Then I asked the question nobody seemed eager to answer. How many Redwood employees were expected to lose their positions during the first 90 days? Michael looked down at the spreadsheet. Grant said approximately 180. I asked how much of the first-year financial projection depended on those reductions happening exactly as planned. The room went quiet. Daniel turned one page toward them. Nearly 40% of the projected improvement came from payroll savings. That was too much dependence on a single assumption, especially when the financing structure pushed part of the downside toward us. Grant said acquisitions always required difficult decisions. I agreed. Then I told him difficult decisions still had to be modeled honestly. If Redwood needed restructuring, put it in the risk case. Do not bury it inside an optimistic base case and expect Blackridge to finance the difference if reality arrived. Nobody argued with that. We spent another hour rebuilding the assumptions. The revised model lowered first-year earnings expectations, preserved additional working capital, and removed the automatic pressure to make immediate reductions simply to satisfy a forecast. It did not guarantee every job. No responsible investor could promise that. But it made the transaction depend less on people becoming numbers on a savings schedule. By 5:30, Michael had a model I could defend. Rachel had restored the covenant language and added the disclosures Daniel requested. Grant sat across from me looking exhausted, but different, less certain, maybe more thoughtful. He asked whether the deal was finally acceptable. I read the signature page one last time. There are moments when power becomes most dangerous because using it feels satisfying. I could have delayed them another day. I could have made Grant explain himself again. I could have turned his embarrassment into entertainment for my team. None of that would have improved the transaction. So I signed. One signature. Black ink on white paper. $200 million moved from possibility toward reality. Nobody applauded. I preferred it that way. Grant thanked me and said he had learned something during the previous 24 hours. I told him I hoped it was about disclosure. He gave a tired smile and said it was about assumptions. Before leaving, he paused at the door and told me Lauren had earned her position at Vantage Meridian on her own. I said I knew. That had never been the question. When the room finally emptied, Daniel asked whether signing felt good. I looked at the page and realized it felt almost ordinary. The business problem had been solved. The harder problem was waiting at home. At 7:12, I pulled into my driveway and found Lauren sitting at the kitchen table where Blackridge had started 14 years earlier. She had placed her phone face down. No laptop. No corporate smile. When I walked in, she looked at me and said she finally understood why the signature had never been the most important thing between us. Lauren waited until I sat down before she spoke again. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator humming behind us and the faint sound of traffic beyond the neighborhood. 14 years earlier, that same table had held takeout containers, unpaid bills, and the first Blackridge spreadsheets. Now it held 2 cups of coffee and everything we had failed to say. Lauren told me she had spent the entire day thinking about one question. If I had been exactly the man she described at the gala, a husband doing small consulting jobs from home, would her words have been acceptable? She looked at me and answered her own question. No. That was the first apology that reached me. Not because it was dramatic. Because it had nothing to do with money. She said finding out what Blackridge had become forced her to see something she did not like about herself. She had started treating status as evidence of worth. Somewhere between promotions, executive dinners, and conversations about houses and titles, she had begun measuring our marriage against people who barely knew us. I listened without interrupting. She did not blame Grant. She did not blame work. She did not blame me for being private. She said those influences mattered, but the choices were hers. Then she told me she had scheduled an appointment with a counselor for the following week. Not because she expected it to save our marriage automatically. Because she needed to understand why approval from a room full of executives had become more important than protecting the dignity of the person beside her. I respected that. But respect was not the same as repair. I told her I loved the woman I married, and I still cared deeply about the woman sitting across from me. What I did not know was whether I trusted the space between us anymore. Lauren nodded. Her eyes lowered, but she did not ask me to make her feel better. That mattered too. We agreed to live separately for a while. I kept a furnished apartment near Blackridge for late meetings, so I moved there that weekend with one suitcase. No dramatic goodbye. No slammed doors. Just distance. The months that followed surprised me. Lauren stayed at Vantage Meridian and never once asked me to influence her career. She earned another major account on her own. She kept going to counseling. She stopped attending every corporate social event she was invited to. More importantly, I heard about those changes from other people before she ever mentioned them to me. Change looks different when nobody knows you are watching. 3 months later, we started meeting for breakfast every other Sunday at a small diner outside Charlotte. Vinyl booths. strong coffee, pancakes too large for the plates. We talked slowly, first about practical things, then about us. 6 months after the gala, Lauren asked whether I believed we could ever become what we had been before. I told her no. She looked down. Then I told her that might be the best thing that could happen to us. The old marriage had taught both of us how easily love could survive while respect quietly disappeared. I did not want the old marriage back. If we tried again, I wanted something more honest. Something where neither of us needed to become smaller for the other to feel important. The following Friday, I drove my old pickup back to the house. Lauren opened the door before I reached the porch. No polished smile. No executive version of herself. Just Lauren. I brought a bottle of sparkling cider. She made dinner. We sat at the same kitchen table where Blackridge had begun and where our marriage had almost ended. I still did not know what the next 10 years would look like. Neither did she. But for the first time in a long time, uncertainty did not feel like failure. It felt honest. I had spent years believing being underestimated was harmless as long as I knew who I was. I had been wrong about one thing. It mattered when the person beside you joined the people doing the underestimating. Money never fixed that. My signature never fixed that. The only thing that gave us another beginning was something quieter. She learned to see me without needing anyone else to confirm my value. And I learned that strength was not staying silent forever. Sometimes strength was finally saying what respect required, then giving the truth enough room to prove whether anything worth saving remained.